Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery, every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot as he unravels a masterpiece that wasn't painted, sculpted, or signed, but carved in silence by hands that would never touch stone again. A final creation, left behind by a stone carver whose last work speaks louder than any confession. Stay with me till the end, because the truth hidden inside this final masterpiece is not just brilliant, it's devastating. So pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second until the very end. Chapter 1. The Stonecarver's Last Strike. The storm struck the Cornish coast with a fury that seemed almost theatrical, rattling shutters and hissing against the windows of the grand old estate known as Mornmere Hall. Lightning forked across the horizon, casting skeletal shadows across the cliffs. Inside, the warm golden glow of candlelight flickered nervously against the high stone walls of the drawing room. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall, patron of the arts and custodian of his family's legacy, stood by the grand fireplace. His thick silver hair caught the light like the crest of a marble statue, and he held in his hand a small, velvet-lined box. All conversation halted when he opened it. Inside lay a chisel, short, iron-bound, with a handle worn smooth by decades of use. It was the personal tool of Ignatius Drouet, the reclusive master stonecarver, whose commissions adorned cathedrals, manors, and cemeteries throughout Europe. Drouet had died just 2 days before, found slumped over his workbench in the hall's East Wing studio. The cause, the local doctor said, was a simple heart attack. But to some in the room, there was nothing simple about it. This, Sir Gabriel said with gravitas, was to be his final masterpiece. A commission I intended to unveil next month at the Royal Guild Centennial. Now it will remain incomplete. The box snapped shut. Among the gathering of guests, an unusual mix of artists, critics, and Rivenhall family. Unease crackled like dry twigs underfoot. Faces turned away, some out of grief, others out of something far less pure. For though Drouet was admired, even revered, he was also feared. A man of fierce pride, rigid solitude, and complicated loyalties. He had left behind no sketches, no notes. Only the half-shaped marble block, its surface veined like a secret waiting to be revealed. Seated near the piano was Sylvette Drouet, the artist's only daughter, a statuesque woman of 35 with a sculptor's calloused hands and her father's icy discipline. She was pale tonight, her expression unreadable. Across from her, with a tumbler of whiskey already half drained, sat Lucien Broom, the guild's curator and longtime rival of Drouet. He seemed relaxed, but his eyes flicked often toward the eastern corridor. Was he working alone? Asked a smooth voice belonging to Lavinia Whitelake, a celebrated art historian whose biography of Drouet had earned her both acclaim and a bitter lawsuit from the subject himself. I had heard whispers of an assistant. There was none, Sylvette replied coolly, not looking up. He never allowed it. But Lavinia smiled faintly, as if she knew better. Another peal of thunder rolled in from the sea. It was then that Inspector Darnley, the local constable, entered, sodden hat in hand. Apologies for the intrusion, he said. But there's something you ought to know. A preliminary report from the coroner just came through. There were traces of powdered aconite in Drouet's tea flask. A sudden, stunned silence gripped the room. Poison. Sir Gabriel said, his voice low with disbelief. Are you certain? As certain as science can be, sir. Someone added it during his final hours. Lavinia set down her glass with a delicate clink. Broom muttered something under his breath. Sylvette did not move at all. Sir Gabriel turned slowly to face the inspector. This is deeply troubling. There's more, Darnley continued. The studio, locked from the inside, was untouched save for one thing. The final marble. It's gone. A low gasp spread like smoke. Gone. Broom barked. You mean someone stole it? Darnley nodded grimly. It's vanished. We believed it sometime last night. The lock was forced and replaced with a false bolt. The theft was deliberate and skillful. Sir Gabriel leaned heavily on the mantel. So now we have not only a dead master, but a missing work of art. And, said Darnley with emphasis, a murder. He paused, then added with an edge of both hesitation and hope, I've already contacted London. There is, as you might imagine, only one man for something of this nature. The name needed no utterance, for it carried with it an echo of countless solved crimes, of order imposed upon chaos, of the curious triumph of mind over malice. Hercule Poirot, somewhere in London, amid the quiet civility of his perfectly ordered apartment, the great detective sat, straight-backed, by the window, sipping hot chocolate from a porcelain cup. The envelope in his lap bore the crest of Cornwall's constabulary and the seal of urgency. His mustaches twitched with quiet satisfaction. Ah, he murmured, a sculptor, a poisoned flask, and a vanished masterpiece. This, mon ami Hastings, will require not the strength of the arm, but the finesse of the little gray cells. He stood, placed the cup precisely upon its saucer, and reached for his traveling gloves. For murder, once again, had dared to strike art at its most sacred, and Hercule Poirot would not permit beauty to be silenced without answer. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The rain had tapered to a mournful drizzle by the time Hercule Poirot arrived at Mornmere Hall the following afternoon. His coat, immaculately brushed despite the journey, bore no trace of the weather's wrath. He paused before the great arched entrance, gazing up at the weathered stone facade as though reading its long-kept secrets. A butler led him through wide corridors lined with family portraits and crumbling Gothic arches. Poirot's eyes moved with the precision of a surgeon, noting the faint mud trail by the baseboard, the absence of a certain vase on a plinth. Dust rings always betray such changes, and the lingering scent of turpentine that clung faintly to the air. Each detail tucked itself away in his mind. Sir Gabriel awaited him in the drawing-room, now subdued and shrouded in the long shadows of a cloud-heavy afternoon. Monsieur Poirot, he greeted, extending a hand with the weight of weariness. We are in need of clarity. You are in need of truth, Poirot replied with polite solemnity. That, I hope, I can provide. He was offered tea, which he declined, and led at once to the studio where the crime had occurred. The corridor to the east wing grew colder as they approached, the floor tiles slick beneath Poirot's patent leather shoes. When they reached the studio door, Inspector Darnley was already waiting. I've secured the space as you requested, he said, unlocking the door with a turn of a long brass key. No one's entered since yesterday. Poirot stepped into the studio. The room was vast, lit by high windows now dulled by grime and rain. The faint, chalky scent of cut stone still lingered. Tools were arranged neatly on a rack, chisels, rasps, and mallets, and there, beneath a white shroud, stood the heavy workbench. Poirot moved with deliberate grace, his eyes narrowing to observe without touching. It is most curious, he murmured, that the marble is gone, and yet all else remains undisturbed. Sir Gabriel frowned. You mean to suggest the thief took only the masterpiece? Mais oui. A most select thief indeed. Not a burglary, but a message. He bent down near the bench, where an outline of white dust formed a rectangle on the stone floor. This is where the block stood. Yes, said Darnley. Roughly a meter wide, nearly 2 in height. Must have weighed hundreds of pounds. Poirot straightened and adjusted his cuffs. And yet it was moved silently, with no witnesses and no trace. Darnley looked sheepish. It seemed so. The door had been locked from the inside, but the bolt was tampered with. Almost perfectly. Poirot's eyes swept the corners of the room. Locked rooms are like puzzles with extra pieces, Inspector. They tempt us to believe in impossibility when the answer is merely unobserved. He paused by the tea flask, still sitting on a side shelf, untouched since the discovery. Poirot removed his gloves, leaned in, and gave a delicate sniff. Bitter almond and something earthy. Not natural to tea. Aconite, said Darnley. We found traces inside. Poisoning confirmed. And the cup. Clean. Drouet was drinking directly from the flask. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Then he trusted it, or believed it untouched. He stepped over to the tall windows and pressed a gloved finger to the sill. A thin line of moisture clung there, along with something else. Fine dust. Stone residue, he murmured. Not yet washed away by rain. This window was opened recently. Perhaps the thief did not exit through the door after all. Sir Gabriel looked astonished. Are you saying the marble was removed through the window? Poirot shook his head. Non. That would be quite the feat, without notice. But something was passed, perhaps a tool, a message, or the poison. He walked to a cabinet tucked beside the workbench, noting that the lock had been scratched but not broken. Poirot examined the scratches. Someone fumbled here. In haste, perhaps? Or fear? Inside the cabinet were bundles of design sketches, some torn, others half-burned. Poirot removed one gingerly. It depicted a figure kneeling, arms outstretched. The lines were bold, but unfinished. This, Poirot said softly, was not the style of Ignatius Drouet. It bears another hand. Darnley glanced over. You mean Sylvette? Possibly, said Poirot. But this drawing, if found among her father's possessions, suggests more than a mere legacy. It suggests collaboration. Sir Gabriel's brow creased. But she said she never worked with him. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then we have found our first contradiction. As he returned the sketch, something slipped from the folder. A folded note, creased and thumb-worn. Poirot opened it. It read, What is carved in stone may still be broken. Meet me by the tide clock, midnight. Come alone. Unsigned. Poirot's mustaches bristled. Inspector, he said crisply, let us begin interviews at once. The mind of a murderer is like a sculpture. It hides the truth until you know where to chip. And with that, he turned, eyes sharp with anticipation. The game had begun. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. By late evening, the drawing room of Mornmere Hall had been transformed into something not unlike a stage. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle near the fire, and the lamps were drawn low, casting warm pools of light that gave each guest's face an eerie softness. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fallow, moved quietly about the room with her usual stiff precision, offering refreshments that no one touched. Hercule Poirot stood near the window, framed by the heavy drapes. His silhouette, slight and composed, gave no indication of the storm that brewed within his mind. Inspector Darnley entered with his notepad clutched tightly, glancing about as though gauging the mood of the gathering before clearing his throat. We shall begin, then, if you're all comfortable, Poirot said, his voice even. You are not here under suspicion, MES Amos, but under observation. Please keep that distinction in mind. The guests were an eclectic assembly, each one tethered to Ignatius Drouet by threads of admiration, obligation, or hostility. First among them was Sylvette Drouet, her father's heir in every artistic sense, seated upright in a chair by the piano. She wore black, as she had for the past 2 days, though her face bore no overt grief. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, were dusted faintly with stone powder, a detail Poirot had already noted. Then came Luchenbroom, the guild curator, whose trousers bore a faint crease even now, and whose shirt cuffs peeked from beneath a tailored jacket like whispers of privilege. He sipped from a glass he hadn't put down all evening, though Poirot suspected it was more for effect than thirst. Next was Lavinia Whitelake, author, historian, and relentless truth-seeker, or so she would claim. Her eyes remained sharp behind pince-nez glasses, though she blinked often, as though reviewing unseen notes in her mind. Her smile was brittle. Her voice, when she spoke, would be honeyed and lethal. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall stood apart, leaning against the stone mantel with an expression that was difficult to place. His features suggested concern, but Poirot saw something more subdued, calculation, perhaps, or guilt of another sort. At the far edge of the room, somewhat apart from the others, sat Miles Kent, a young art restorer who had arrived a few months ago under Sir Gabriel's patronage. He was not well known among the guests, and he seemed content to remain unnoticed, but his eyes rarely left Sylvette. Poirot took his place at the center. I begin MES Amos with a simple observation, he said. Every one of you had cause to love or loathe Monsieur Drouet. Love for his genius, loathe for his pride. Admire him you might, but none found him easy. None. No one spoke, though Lucien shifted in his chair. Poirot smiled faintly. Let us take you, Monsieur Broom. You and the late Monsieur Drouet were long-time rivals, were you not? Broom snorted. Rivals? Hardly. The man refused guild exhibitions, turned down every commission he couldn't dictate. He was a hermit with a chisel. Yet you visited him last Thursday, Poirot said, lifting one eyebrow. Broom's glass paused midair. I was invited. Sir Gabriel hoped Drouet might consider allowing the guild to fund his final piece. Sir Gabriel nodded. I thought a public collaboration might soften Drouet's tendencies. It did not. Poirot turned. Mademoiselle Whitelake, you also had business with the deceased NSC Pa? Lavinia's lips curled. I was writing his second biography. I had come for an interview, one he had agreed to. That was Friday morning. He threw me out after 15 minutes. Why? Poirot asked, eyes narrowing. Because I asked about the war, she said coolly. His past in the French resistance. He never forgave me for printing that rumor in my first book. Poirot tilted his head slightly. And yet you came again the following day? I left a note. He did not reply. I took that as confirmation of his character. A small murmur stirred, but Poirot raised a hand for silence. He turned now to Sylvette. Mademoiselle, forgive my bluntness. Your relationship with your father was a cordial? She met his gaze without flinching. It was strained, but we understood each other. Poirot nodded. And the drawing we found in his cabinet? It is yours. There was a pause. Yes, she said at last. He wouldn't let me help with the carving, but he asked to see my design. That one was mine. Then you were not wholly excluded from the masterpiece. No, she said softly. But he never showed me the marble. He worked behind a curtain. I hadn't seen the sculpture in weeks. Poirot considered her carefully. And Miles Kent, he said, turning to the quiet figure near the bookshelf. You worked in the Manor's restoration wing. Did you interact with Monsieur Drouet? Kent nodded slowly. A few times. He didn't like questions. I kept out of his way. Did you deliver anything to him? Once or twice, chisels, fresh clothes, a cup of tea. From the kitchen. Poirot's mustaches twitched. There. Inspector Darnley shifted uneasily. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch before speaking again. Each of you was near him in his final days. Each of you has a reason to lie or to fear the truth. But I assure you, the truth, it comes all the same. He turned from the group and stepped toward the window. Rain tapped again at the glass. I will begin formal interviews in the morning, Poirot said without looking back. For now, you may retire. But I suggest you reflect carefully on what you know and what you believe no one else does. And with that, the little Belgian detective left the room, leaving behind an air of questions that refused to settle. The suspects, like statues, remained motionless, each knowing that soon the chiseling would begin. Chapter 4, Poirot Arrives. The next morning dawned brittle and gray, the Cornish coastline wreathed in mist. From the windows of Mornmere Hall, the cliffs seemed to fade into nothing. The sea, beyond a distant murmur, like breath drawn through stone lungs. It was a fitting landscape, Hercule Poirot thought, for a crime so peculiar, half-seen and clouded in silence. Poirot stood in the small breakfast room, meticulously spreading marmalade upon toast with the precision of a draftsman etching plans. Inspector Darnley, seated opposite, watched with thinly veiled impatience. You really believe the missing sculpture is the key? Darnley asked, cradling his tea. I believe, said Poirot, without looking up, that the sculpture is not merely missing. It is deliberately missing. Someone wished for it to vanish, not to sell it, but to silence it. Darnley frowned. You speak of it as though it were alive. Poirot's eyes sparkled. Art, mon ami, is always alive to the one who fears what it reveals. He finished his breakfast and dabbed at his mouth with a napkin. Now, I should like to take a walk around the house grounds, alone. Afterwards, I will conduct my interviews. The suspects, I think, will be quite ready to speak now. Poirot took his cane and hat and stepped into the cool morning air. The estate sprawled in elegant decay. He walked slowly through the overgrown garden, the crunch of gravel underfoot like a metronome to his thoughts. He paused before a peculiar sculpture tucked into a hedge alcove, one of Drouet's older works. A hooded figure with no face. The surface pitted with age. Poirot stared at it for a long moment, then smiled faintly and turned away. He returned inside by a side entrance and passed a narrow hallway near the east wing. There, half hidden beneath a decorative tapestry, was a scuff mark on the wooden floor, recent, elongated, curved. He crouched, ran a finger along it, and murmured, "A crate or a dolly wheel." Something was moved this way. He rose and adjusted his cuffs before making his way toward the studio once again, retracing the same corridor they had taken the previous afternoon. As he neared the door, a rustle caught his ear. He turned, just in time to see Miles Kent disappear into the shadows of a branching hallway. Poirot said nothing. He made a mental note. By mid-morning, the drawing room had been transformed once more, this time into an interrogation chamber of quiet civility. Poirot stood at the center of the rug, his notebook untouched. The suspects entered one by one. First, Lucien Broom. He settled into the high-backed chair with a sigh, as though this were an unfortunate chore. "You did not like Monsieur Drouet," Poirot began. "Is that a crime?" Broom quipped. "I disliked his manner, not his work." "You visited him 2 days before his death." "Correct." "He refused to speak to me, told me to get out. I left." "And yet you remained on the grounds?" Broom's eyes flickered. "Gabriel invited me to stay. There was to be a guild discussion." "Did you see the sculpture?" "I caught a glimpse. Just a cloth-covered form. Nothing more." "You didn't speak to Sylvette?" "We exchanged frosty glances. She detests me." "Why?" Broom shrugged. "Because I questioned her talent. Once." Poirot nodded slowly. "That is often quite enough." Next, Lavinia Whitelake. She entered like a woman giving a lecture. Chin high, spine straight. "You knew secrets about the sculptor's past," Poirot began. Secrets he did not want published. "I suspected secrets," Lavinia corrected. "He was in France during the war. Records are incomplete. He resurfaced in 1946 under a new name. Curious, isn't it?" Poirot said nothing. "I asked about it. He grew furious. Threw his ink bottle at me. I left with it, still dripping down my blouse. And yet you returned." "I left a note." He never replied. "Did you go near the studio again?" "No." Poirot raised one brow. "Not even to look." Lavinia hesitated. "I passed by. The curtain was drawn. I saw nothing." He watched her carefully. "And yet you saw someone enter?" Another hesitation. "Yes." "The young man. Kent. He was carrying something." Poirot offered a faint smile. "Merci." Then, Sylvette Drouet. She entered like marble in motion. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began softly, "you loved your father?" She hesitated. "I respected him. I loved him once. He was not a kind man. But he was proud of you." She looked down. "He never said so." "You gave him your drawing. A piece of yourself." "Yes." "Do you know what he was carving?" "No." "Did he ever speak of destroying it?" Her eyes widened, and for the first time emotion flickered. "Destroy it." Poirot leaned forward. Someone feared what it revealed. Enough to poison him. She blinked. "I don't know anything about poison." "No. But perhaps you know who did." She said nothing. Last, Miles Kent. He stood rather than sat. His hands fidgeted behind his back. "You served the household in many ways." "Yes," he said. "Whatever was needed." "You admired Sylvette." Kent flicked. "I respected her. As an artist." "You were seen near the studio." "I delivered supplies. Clothes. Thea. Sir Gabriel asked me to assist the carver." "And did he allow it?" Kent shook his head. Barely spoke. He worked alone. Poirot stepped closer. "And yet, the morning of his death, you were seen near the tide clock. Midnight." Kent's eyes flickered. "I needed air." Poirot did not press. "Merci." When the interviews were done, Poirot returned to his room. He sat hand-steepled. 4 suspects. 4 masks. But one among them, he knew, had worn theirs too well. Soon, it would begin to crack. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The study at Mornmere Hall had not been used in years, or so the butler confessed. Poirot had insisted upon it. He preferred its darker, quieter atmosphere. The drawn velvet curtains, the low crackle of fire in the hearth, the slightly musty air that suggested long-shelved secrets. It was in this room that he had decided to conduct deeper, private interviews with each suspect. In the drawing room, people performed. In the study, they revealed. He began with Lavinia Whitelake. She entered at precisely 10 o'clock, punctual and poised. Poirot motioned to the armchair across from his. "Forgive the formality," he said. "This is merely conversation." "Conversation with Hercule Poirot is rarely casual," she replied with a tight smile. "Indeed," Poirot admitted, "but necessary." He folded his hands and tilted his head. "Tell me again about your interest in Monsieur Drouet's wartime past." Lavinia's eyes gleamed. There were inconsistencies in his timeline, years that don't appear in any record. He emerged after the war with a different surname. "I made inquiries, found whispers of a French sculptor arrested by the Germans for smuggling refugees through the Pyrenees. But the trail stopped cold." "You believe this man and Drouet were one and the same?" "I still do. He changed his name out of trauma. Or shame." Poirot nodded. "Or to escape something." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "That someone feared exposure. Perhaps not for what they did, but for who they were." She stiffened. "I wanted the truth. That's not a crime." "Non," Poirot said gently, "but pursuing it can provoke dangerous reactions." Lavinia said nothing more. Poirot let the silence linger before dismissing her with a courteous nod. Next came Lucien Broom, less refined than before. His collar was slightly askew, and he no longer carried a glass of whiskey. "You are a man of pride, Monsieur Broom," Poirot said. "But pride, like marble, can be brittle." Broom scowled. "If this is about rivalry, Drouet and I haven't spoken civilly in 5 years. Yet you were still here. Gabriel invited me." "I said that already." Poirot steepled his fingers. "You knew about the sculpture?" "No one really knew. He kept it hidden." "You didn't attempt to see it?" "I may have tried the door once. It was locked." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "But you did not try the window?" Broom's brow furrowed. "No. Should I have?" "Curiosity is often a powerful force, monsieur. Not when the man inside throws things at your head," Broom muttered. "He was mad. Brilliant, yes. But mad." Poirot sat back. "Did you poison him?" Broom gaped. "What?" "I find it is often wise to ask a question directly. The answer is rarely the point, the reaction is." Broom rose. "I had nothing to gain from his death." Poirot lifted a brow. "On the contrary, a posthumous unveiling of his last work, under Guild exhibition, would raise your prestige quite a bit, non." Broom said nothing, only turned and left. Poirot smiled faintly. Sylvette Drouet was next. She stood in the doorway a long moment before entering. Poirot motioned for her to sit. "You do not trust me," he said. "No," she replied plainly. "I don't trust anyone." Poirot regarded her. "Your father was not easy. But his death, you did not expect it." "No. But I knew he was working too hard. Sleeping less. His heart was already strained." Poirot said, "And yet he drank the tea. The same tea you once used to prepare for him when you were a girl." She blinked. "Yes. It was aconite, mademoiselle. I didn't poison him." Poirot leaned forward. "But you suspected someone might." She hesitated. "Not exactly. But I saw tension. Things weren't right. My father was afraid." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Afraid? Of what?" "I don't know. Or who." He stopped answering the telephone, kept locking the studio. He even kept his tools in a box he carried from room to room. "You didn't ask him? He would have shut me out. More than usual." Poirot nodded slowly. "Did you see the sculpture?" "No. But I heard him working. The hammer, the chisel. Sometimes late into the night. And the night before he died. I heard nothing." Poirot sat silently, digesting her words. She stood to leave. But as she reached the door, she turned. "There's something else. I found a second key in his coat pocket after he died. A key that doesn't belong to any lock in the house." Poirot's mustaches twitched. "May I see it?" She reached into her pocket and handed it over. It was bronze old-fashioned, the teeth unusually long and narrow. Poirot turned it over in his hand. "This," he said softly, "is not a key to a door." She left without another word. Miles Kent was last. He entered nervously, fiddling with a paint-smeared handkerchief. "You were seen near the Tide Clock the night before the murder," Poirot said. "I told you I needed air." "You received a note. Did you go?" Kent hesitated. "Yes. I thought it was Sylvette. I'd slipped a letter into her sketchbook earlier that day. But it wasn't her who summoned you." "No. No one came." "You didn't see anything? Hear anything?" Kent fidgeted. "I heard footsteps, twice. But they didn't stop. Just passed by. Like someone pacing the bluff." "You feared discovery?" "Yes. I shouldn't have been there." Poirot stood and approached him. "You wanted her trust. Perhaps even her affection." Kent lowered his eyes. "But the man who carved stone for a living, he would never approve." Kent said nothing. Poirot dismissed him gently. Alone once more, Poirot studied the strange bronze key. A key that opened no door in Mornmere Hall. A key meant for something hidden or long forgotten. Whatever it unlocked, Poirot knew, it would not just open a mechanism. It would open the past. Chapter 6. The First False Lead. Late afternoon sun filtered through the narrow library windows of Mornmere Hall, casting long, burnished beams across the carpet and the spines of old books. Hercule Poirot sat at the far end of a long oak table, the bronze key before him, glinting dully under the light of a brass desk lamp. Inspector Darnley leaned against a high-back chair, arms crossed. "You think it's not for a door?" Darnley asked, eyeing the key. Poirot shook his head slowly. "Non. It is too narrow, too long in the shaft. Such a key is for a drawer, a compartment, perhaps something older, a box, or a casket." Darnley frowned. "You think there's another object missing besides the marble?" "I think," said Poirot, "that the sculpture was not the only thing worth stealing, or hiding." He rose suddenly. "Let us revisit the studio. There is something I did not yet verify." The studio, chilled by the stone walls and the late hour, was as they had left it. Poirot moved to the tool cabinet once more, this time removing all the contents, one by one, laying them in precise rows on the nearby bench. Behind the last shelf, tucked deep in the shadowed recesses of the cabinet's back panel, Poirot's hand paused. There was a faint line, barely perceptible, etched into the wood grain. "A false panel," Poirot whispered. "Voila." With delicate fingers, he pried at the seam. The wood gave with a soft pop, revealing a hidden compartment no larger than a shoebox. Inside lay a velvet pouch, dusty, knotted shut. Darnley stepped closer as Poirot untied the cord. Within the pouch was a silver pocketbook, a bundle of aged letters, and a small, worn envelope labeled simply, "To be destroyed if I die." Poirot's brow furrowed. He opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, black and white, frayed at the corners. It showed a group of 5 men in military uniform, seated around a carved stone altar. Drouet was one of them. Another figure, though older, bore a striking resemblance to Sir Gabriel Rivenhall. Poirot stared at the image for a long moment. It was not just art Drouet worked in, he murmured. It was a secret. Back in the drawing room, Sir Gabriel stood at the fireplace, staring into the flames. Poirot entered silently, the photograph in hand. "I wondered," Poirot said, "if you could help me identify this." Gabriel turned slowly. When he saw the image, the blood drained from his face. Where did you find that?" "In a secret drawer, hidden by a man afraid." Sir Gabriel took the photograph, staring down at it. "This was taken in 43, in France. Drouet and I were part of an operations group, smuggling art and refugees through the southern hills. We used a chapel, hidden in a quarry, as a waypoint. And the others? 2 were captured. 1 died of illness. The 5th, Bertrand Mornay, was later accused of theft. He betrayed a rout to the Germans. Drouet was the only one who knew his fate." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And what became of Mornay?" Sir Gabriel hesitated. Drouet claimed he confronted him. Said Mornay disappeared, but he never shared the details. only said he had carved something in memory. Poirot nodded slowly. A sculpture. Sir Gabriel blinked. You think his final masterpiece was connected to that? I believe, Poirot said softly, it was not a memorial. It was a confession. An hour later, Inspector Darnley stormed into the parlor, his boots muddy, his face flushed. We've found something, he said. In Miles Kent's room, hidden beneath the bed. Poirot glanced up. A heavy mallet, with a trace of marble dust on the head, and fragments of cloth. It matches the fabric used to cover the missing sculpture. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Darnley went on. We also found a map of the estate, markings that trace a path from the east wing to the coastal caves. And we believe the sculpture was moved down there, concealed. Poirot said nothing for a long moment. At last, he stood and adjusted his cuffs. Then let us confirm what Monsieur Kent has hidden. The descent to the caves was treacherous. The cliffs were slick with sea spray, the stone steps carved crudely into the slope. Darnley led the way, flashlight in hand. Poirot followed, carefully avoiding the edges. At the mouth of the cave, the wind howled low and guttural, echoing off the stone walls like the breath of something ancient. Inside, behind a rock fall and partially covered with a faded tarpaulin, they found it. The sculpture. It stood nearly 2 meters tall. The sheet peeled back revealed the carved image, a kneeling man, his face upturned, arms outstretched in anguish. Behind him, barely visible in the veined marble, were ghostly silhouettes, soldiers, stone faces, and at the base, an inscription in Latin. Darnley read aloud, Et in memoriae me judicium vivit. Poirot translated softly, and in my memory judgment shall live. The figure's face, though stylized, was clearly identifiable. Bertrand Mornay. Back at the hall, Miles Kent was already in custody, pale and shaking. Poirot entered the study to find him slumped in a chair. I didn't kill him, Kent stammered. I found the sculpture after he died. I knew what it was. I wanted to protect Sylvette. I thought if people saw what he'd carved, what it meant, she'd be ruined. Her father would be remembered not as an artist, but something else. Poirot studied him in silence. Then, softly, You moved it alone? Kent nodded. It took hours. I used a dolly and ropes. I planned it for weeks, just in case. But I didn't poison him. I swear it. Poirot turned away, thoughtful. A powerful motive. A convincing story. A suspect caught red-handed. And yet, in Poirot's mind, something did not sit right. This, he knew, was too soon. Too clean. The truth, like marble, needed more carving yet. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. That night, the house grew unnaturally still. The corridors of Mornmere Hall, once humming with quiet movement, now echoed with silence that seemed to listen. In the drawing room, the fire burned low, casting long flickers across the high walls and pulling shadows from the furniture, like secrets from the soul. Hercule Poirot sat alone, gazing into the flames, fingers steepled under his chin. Miles Kent had been taken to the village jail. His protestations of innocence lingered like mist. A clear motive, a secreted sculpture, damning physical evidence. It was a tidy solution. Too tidy. And Poirot distrusted tidiness. At precisely 11 o'clock, he rose and made his way to the study once more. A thin notebook in his hand, the photograph from the hidden drawer tucked inside. He did not summon the suspects. He knew they would come. They always did, when silence grew loud enough. The first was Lavinia Whitelake. She entered quietly, her composure still intact, though her eyes flicked once to the notebook Poirot carried. You wish to speak? She asked, arching a brow. Poirot did not rise. I wondered, madam, how a woman who spent her career excavating the truths of others could miss one buried in plain sight. She tilted her head. You're referring to Kent? Non. I am referring to yourself. She stiffened. Poirot continued gently. You said you visited Drouet on Friday, that he threw you out after 15 minutes. Yes. Then why? Poirot asked softly. Did Mrs. Fallow, the housekeeper, say she saw you return that evening and slip something under his studio door? Lavinia's composure cracked just slightly. I left him a second note. What did it say? Her voice dropped. I told him I knew the truth, that I had the photograph, that I would go public unless he spoke to me again. Poirot nodded. Blackmail is so ugly, Walt, n'est-ce pas? But your motives were not for money. You wanted your version of history validated. She looked down. And when he refused, Poirot continued, you feared what would happen if someone else exposed it first. Lavinia looked up sharply. I didn't kill him. But you feared the consequences of silence. I wanted him to admit what he'd done, she said bitterly. He carved a memorial to a man he claimed to have condemned. A traitor. And yet, what if Druitt hadn't told the full truth? Poirot's voice was very soft. Did you ever consider that the carving was a confession, not of judgment, but of guilt? Lavinia faltered. He dismissed her with a nod. She left without a word. Not 10 minutes later, Sir Gabriel Rivenhall entered, unbidden. He stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping forward. I suppose you found it, he said, not looking at Poirot. The statue. Poirot rose, quietly closing his notebook. Oui. Gabriel crossed to the window and stared out into the night. I recognized the face at once. Druitt never told me he'd sculpted Mornay. I never imagined. You were close to Monday? Gabriel nodded. He was like a brother to me. He saved my life in the resistance. But Druitt never trusted him. Said he betrayed her out. I never believed it. Poirot approached him. You knew Druitt had kept secrets. Perhaps even feared he would reveal them. Gabriel turned. I didn't kill him, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot's eyes did not waver. But you may have feared that his final work would destroy reputations. Perhaps even implicate you. Gabriel's voice dropped. No. I feared it would reopen wounds we never truly closed. There was silence. Then Poirot said quietly, you tried to persuade him to reconsider. That much I believe. Gabriel looked away. He wouldn't listen. Poirot placed a hand on the man's shoulder, gentle, almost paternal. The past, monsieur, is like wet clay. It hardens, but never truly forgets the shape of the hands that are pressed into it. Gabriel departed a moment later, shoulders bowed. Then came Sylvette. She did not knock. She simply entered and sat, as if she had been waiting for her turn in a procession of ghosts. Poirot sat across from her in silence for a long moment. He carved Mornay, she said. Didn't he? Poirot nodded. And you knew? I suspected. The style was not your father's alone. There were traces of your lines in the hands. The curve of the shoulder. She looked at him, startled. He never told me, she said. But you knew. She nodded once. I saw the sketch. Just once. It wasn't labeled. But I recognized the setting. I'd seen the photograph before. Hidden in a book of his. And so you feared what it meant. I didn't want it to be true. That he'd carried this guilt. All his life. I thought his silence was cruel. But it was a shame. Poirot leaned forward. Did you speak to him that night? Sylvette hesitated. Yes. Briefly. We argued. I said I wanted to show the guild the drawing. He told me to leave it alone. And when you left him? He was alive. Poirot watched her for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. Her eyes widened slightly. But someone, Poirot added softly, heard that argument. Someone who understood what the sculpture revealed, and what it would cost them if it ever saw the light of day. Later that night, in the solitude of his chamber, Poirot returned to the photograph. 5 men. 1 vanished. 1 sculpted. 1 dead. 1 key remained. A crack, he thought, had formed. Not in the marble. In someone's mind. And very soon, it would break open. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The following morning brought with it a biting wind and a sea fog that wrapped Mornmere Hall in a pale shroud. The landscape outside the windows was vanishing, cliffs, hedgerows, and even the gravel path lost in an eerie veil. It was as though the world had recoiled inward, mimicking the secrets that had begun to stir within the house. Poirot rose early. Sleep had offered no peace. The identities, the motives, the faces, all circled like a slow procession in his mind. But there was something else now. A feeling not of what had already occurred, but of something imminent. The case was shifting. And it did. At 8:30, the shout came. Poirot was halfway through buttering toast in the breakfast room when a maid burst in, pale and breathless. "It's Mrs. Fallow, sir. She's collapsed in the west hallway." Poirot set down his knife and followed the maid swiftly down the corridor. They found the housekeeper sprawled near the base of a narrow servant's staircase. Her breathing was shallow, her skin waxy. On the floor beside her was a silver tray overturned, the contents spilled, a teacup shattered, a biscuit half smashed, and a small envelope crumpled underfoot. Inspector Darnley knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "She's alive," he muttered. "Barely." Poirot bent to examine the broken teacup. A faint residue clung to the porcelain, nothing overt, but Poirot's nose, already trained to detect subtle scents, picked up something sharp, metallic, aconite. Darnley asked grimly. Poirot nodded. "Or something very close to it." "She must have seen something," Darnley muttered. "Or knew something." Someone silenced her. Poirot's eyes flicked to the envelope. Carefully, he retrieved it and unfolded the paper inside. The handwriting was looping, old-fashioned. "I have remembered something from the night Drouet died. Meet me in the morning." I dare not write it down. It was unsigned. Poirot's eyes narrowed. She was going to tell someone. Perhaps me. But someone else discovered that first. Darnley scowled. "We have a murderer who's not only covering their tracks, but escalating." Poirot stood, silent for a long moment, then murmured, and perhaps panicking. By midday, word had spread through the hall. The atmosphere soured. The guests had been told only that Mrs. Fallow had suffered a fall, but the expressions on their faces suggested suspicion, guilt, fear. Poirot moved among them like a shadow, watching. He said nothing. Lucien Broom appeared rattled, for once. He lingered near the bar cart, nursing something dark and neat. His usual sardonic charm was absent. Poirot noted how he stared often at the hallway where the housekeeper had fallen, as though the corridor might reach out and drag him down. Lavinia Whitelake, on the other hand, was composed, but too much so. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring into space, blinking occasionally, lips pursed tight. Poirot watched her fingers tremble, just once, when the wind moaned through the chimney. And Sylvette? She had retreated entirely, remaining in her studio quarters with the door locked. Poirot had knocked once. No answer. A plea for privacy. Even Sir Gabriel seemed changed, more subdued, more brittle. He paced the drawing room, stopping occasionally to gaze at one of the old Rivenhall portraits. His own father, perhaps, or an ancestor with whom he now shared too much. Poirot, having observed all he needed, returned to the study. There, he laid out the evidence thus far. Drouet, poisoned and his final work stolen, later discovered in the caves. A photograph tying him to wartime events, long buried. Sylvette's sketch within the final sculpture. Lavinia's threats to expose. Kent's cover-up, but no proof of his guilt in the murder. Now an attempted poisoning, likely targeted at Mrs. Fallow, who had claimed to have seen something that fateful night. And one more piece, the bronze key, still in Poirot's possession, still without a lock. Until, suddenly, a memory surfaced. Poirot stood abruptly and left the study. He made his way to the upper floor, passing the gallery of guest rooms, until he reached a door at the end of the hall. It was marked only with an old, faded plaque, Servants' Archive. He had passed it twice and paid it no mind. But now, he inserted the key. It turned smoothly. Inside, dust floated like spores in a shaft of pale light from a narrow window. Old trunks lined the walls. Shelves of ledgers, housekeeping records, inventories. A filing cabinet of ancient correspondence. Poirot scanned quickly, eyes sharp despite the dimness. He found it in a wooden box at the bottom of a shelf. A bundle of sealed documents. War era. Labeled in neat, clerkish script. Quarry Chapel. Contents and Testimonies, 1945. Poirot lifted the box carefully. Something within these pages had scared Ignatius Drouet. Something someone else had killed to keep secret. Poirot did not smile. His face was grave. He returned to the study with the box under one arm and called for Inspector Darnley. "Tell them all to gather in the drawing room," Poirot said quietly. "Tonight, after dinner." Darnley raised a brow. "You found something?" Poirot nodded once. "I believe," he said, "the marble is about to speak." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The drawing room that evening had the weight of an ancient tribunal. The fire crackled, but offered no warmth. The wind howled against the tall windows as if it, too, had come to bear witness. One by one, the suspects took their places. Lucian Broom leaned back with forced indifference. Lavinia Whitelake sat poised with guarded elegance. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall folded his hands tightly together, and Sylvette remained half-turned toward the window, her expression unreadable. Hercule Poirot entered last, followed by Inspector Darnley and the butler, who carried a wooden archive box and set it gently on the sideboard. Poirot walked slowly to the center of the room and turned to face them. "Mess Amos," he began, "it is said that time buries the past. But I have always believed that time merely hides it. The past waits, quietly, until someone listens." He gestured to the archive box. This box was locked away for nearly 3 decades. It belonged to the estate and contained wartime documents from the Quarry Chapel, a place used by several men, including Ignatius Drouet and Sir Gabriel Rivenhall, during the French Resistance. Gabriel stiffened, but said nothing. Included within were testimonies, handwritten accounts. One of them, unsigned, described a night in 1943 when a man named Bertrand Mornay betrayed the location of a refugee passage to the enemy. That betrayal led to several deaths. Sylvette's eyes widened. "My father never told me any of this." Poirot nodded. "Because he buried it. But not with silence, with art. His final sculpture was not merely a condemnation or a memorial. It was a confession. He had not merely witnessed Mornay's downfall. He killed him." Gasps rang through the room. Poirot held up a faded document. This letter, unsigned but bearing a fingerprint later matched to Drouet's studio ledger, describes how Mornay begged for forgiveness. But Drouet, overcome with rage and grief, struck him down in the chapel. He later returned and buried the body beneath the quarry's old altar. The same altar is visible in the photograph. Lucian Broom leaned forward. "You mean Drouet was a murderer?" Poirot did not flinch. In war, such acts are shaded with ambiguity. But Drouet carried the weight of that act his entire life. And when he chose to speak of it, he did so in the only language he trusted, stone. He turned his gaze to Lavinia. "You, Madame Whitelake, sense this truth. You pressured him to speak, to give you an exclusive story, a piece of the hidden legend. You even threatened exposure if he refused." Lavinia's jaw clenched. "But it was not you who killed him, nor was it Monsieur Kent, who merely acted in panic to protect Sylvette from disgrace. Non, the killer was someone with far more to lose, not just a reputation, but a legacy." He looked at Sir Gabriel. "Was it not, monsieur, your fear that Drouet's final work would reveal your own lie?" Gabriel's face was pale. "I don't what lie." Poirot's voice was low. "That you were a patriot, a war hero, yes. But your father, too, was involved. One of the men in the photograph. And he was the true betrayer of the rout, not Mornay." The room went utterly still. "Drouet knew," Poirot continued. "He spared Mornay's life, but swore to protect the truth. And when he realized you had begun to suspect, he carved the statue, not to expose you, but to preserve history honestly. He intended to send it to the guild under Sylvette's name, to avoid scandal. But you saw the face, didn't you?" Gabriel's lips trembled. "I thought it was him. Mornay, the traitor. But the eyes," he trailed off. "They were not Mornay's," Poirot said. "They were your father's." Gabriel staggered back a step. Poirot pressed on, gently but firmly. "You poisoned Drouet's flask. You timed it to act slowly, so the death would resemble a heart attack. You even replaced the studio bolt to make it appear untouched. But you didn't know about the archive box, or that Mrs. Fallow had seen you return to the corridor late that night." Darnley added, "And you tried to silence her when she said she remembered something." "I didn't mean to harm her," Gabriel whispered. "Only to frighten." A sedative in her tea. Just enough to make her dizzy. Poirot shook his head. But she nearly died. Just as Drouet did. Fear drove you, monsieur. Fear of a legacy built on silence, unraveling in a single carving. Gabriel sat heavily in a chair, burying his face in his hands. I only wanted to protect my family name, he said. My father built everything on that lie. If the truth came out. Poirot's voice was kind but unyielding. Then perhaps, at last, it would have been honest. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Poirot turned to the others. Drouet's final masterpiece was not destroyed. It was hidden, protected, and now it will be revealed. Not to shame, but to tell the truth. As he intended, he walked to the mantel and gazed at the fading embers. A legacy of stone cannot be altered, but it can be understood. And behind him, the old house breathed, as though it too had finally exhaled. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The morning after the confrontation, a muted hush hung over Mornmere Hall. The fog had lifted, revealing the moorlands in stark, chilly light, but inside the manor, the air remained heavy, as though the very walls were digesting what had been unveiled the night before. Sir Gabriel had not been arrested. Yet. Inspector Darnley had agreed to allow him to remain under quiet supervision while the final pieces were verified. The truth of Drouet's death, the confession hidden in marble, and the violent silencing of the housekeeper had changed the atmosphere from suspicion to solemnity. But Hercule Poirot, for all his visible composure, had not rested easily. There was still something wrong, something that gnawed at him, not with the noise of doubt, but with the quiet insistence of contradiction. He sat alone in the library that morning, his eyes fixed not on the documents strewn across the desk, but on a single item, the photograph of the 5 men at the Quarry Chapel. 5 men, for accounted for, and one Bertrand Mornay, long thought dead, a man whose face had been carved into the sculpture, a man said to have betrayed the resistance, a man whose body, notably, had never been recovered. Poirot leaned forward, examining the image again. He had been too focused on the faces before. Now he looked at the hands. Each man had placed one hand on the altar in a gesture of solidarity. Except for one, Mornay. His arms were crossed tightly, defensive. An odd pose, if taken willingly. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He retrieved the original archive documents and flipped to the testimony attributed to Drouet. A paragraph near the end caught his attention. I confronted him in the chapel. He denied it. There was shouting. A struggle. He struck his head, and I left him. I believed him dead. I sealed the place behind me and vowed to bury the truth. But I never saw the body again. Poirot's brow furrowed. I believed him dead. Not I saw him die. Not I buried him. Just believed. He stood at once and retrieved the second letter found in the false panel. The one he had barely skimmed before, distracted by the contents of the velvet pouch. Inside, folded with care, was a different kind of note. A letter not from Drouet, but addressed to him. The handwriting was firm, masculine. You may think you carry justice, but what you hold is judgment made in haste. I never betrayed them. I can prove it, but I need time. If you still carry honor, give me that. It was unsigned, but the style was familiar. Too familiar. Poirot reached for the guest registry of Mornmere Hall and traced his finger down to the newest name on the list, Miles Kent. Young, quiet, awkward, helpful, too helpful. Poirot retrieved Kent's letter of application to the restoration program Sir Gabriel had sponsored. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, but the signature was stylized. The K looped high and sharp, exactly like the K in the letter to Drouet. Poirot's eyes widened. Mon Dieu. He turned to the fire and muttered to himself. Kent, not the surname. Kent, as in concealment. A hiding place. A new identity. He stared at the photograph again. On Monday, the chin, the eyes, the shape of the brow. Shaven hair in the photo. A beard now. Younger there, older now, but not unrecognizable. He sat slowly. Mornay lived. It had been the perfect lie. A fake death. A letter begging for time. Drouet, consumed with guilt, had never pursued him. The others had buried the memory. And Mornay, Bertrand Mornay, had changed his name, disappeared, and re-emerged under the roof of the very man who helped send him into hiding. As Miles Kent, Poirot's mind raced. Kent had claimed to protect Sylvette by moving the statue. But what if his motive had been different? He hadn't moved it to protect her reputation. He had moved it to protect himself, to erase the stone face that might reveal his true identity. Poirot stood suddenly and moved briskly toward the east wing. He knocked once on Kent's door. No reply. He knocked again. Still nothing. He turned the knob. It gave way. The room was empty. On the bed lay an open suitcase, clothes half-packed, a shaving kit, a discarded badge from the guild archives. Poirot strode to the writing desk. A letter sat addressed to Sylvette. He opened it slowly. Forgive me. I never meant to lie to you. I loved working beside you, but the past does not forgive easily. I feared what your father would do if you recognized me. When I saw the statue, I knew I had to hide it. He had chosen to expose everything. I had to choose to survive. B.M. Poirot folded the letter. So, not Kent. Not truly. Bertrand Mornay had never died. And the true killer, Gabriel, had killed not to avenge a betrayal, but to preserve the illusion of one. He turned to the window and saw, down the long gravel path, a solitary figure moving toward the stables. Poirot's lips pressed into a line. The past, he whispered, always finds its way back. And this time it had a name, a face, and a truth no chisel could ever bury. Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. The stables behind Mornmere Hall had long since fallen into dignified disuse. Timbers aged silver by years of salt-laced wind. Roof tiles warped like a sleeping serpent's back. Once home to fine horses and sleek carriages, they now served as storage for firewood, broken furniture, and the quiet exiles of a grand house's memory. It was there that Hercule Poirot found Miles Kent, or rather, Bertrand Mornay. He stood near the tack wall, hands trembling as he tried to close the buckles on a worn leather satchel. The coat he wore was heavy, almost too formal for the countryside, and the scarf knotted around his throat seemed more like armor than warmth. He didn't hear Poirot enter. You were not packing, Poirot said softly. You were fleeing. Mornay spun, the color draining from his face. You shouldn't be here, he said, voice cracking. It's done now. Non, monsieur. Nothing is ever truly done until the truth stands naked in the light. And you are not finished yet. The satchel slipped from Mornay's hands. He backed away from Poirot, eyes darting toward the open rear door. I didn't kill him, he whispered. You know I didn't. You read the letter. I never meant for any of this to happen. Poirot nodded slowly. No, I do not believe you murdered Ignatius Drouet. But I believe you ran when you realized what he had carved. When you saw your face in marble, frozen in grief, in accusation, you understood that the past you'd buried had found a voice. I didn't betray anyone, Mornay said bitterly. Not then. Not now. But you let them believe you had, Poirot replied. And Sir Gabriel, he built his entire narrative upon that lie. He was murdered to protect it. Drouet knew the truth, and he finally tried to speak it with stone. Mornay lowered his gaze. I hid the statue to stop the spiral. I thought if no one ever saw it, everything could stay quiet. But that house, it's full of eyes. Even the walls remember. Poirot stepped forward, close now, his tone quieter still. You wrote to Drouet. You asked for time. He gave it to you, non? Years of silence. Years of safety. But he also gave you the burden of memory. Mornay's shoulders sagged. He never replied. Because he thought you were dead. And when you reappeared, under a new name, working under Sir Gabriel, he did not betray you. He watched. And when he began to carve, he did not accuse, he tried to understand. Mornay stared at him. How can you know that? Because he left no inscription, no date, no signature. He made the face haunting, but not condemning. You see, Monsieur Mornay, he believed in atonement, not revenge. A silence stretched between them. Outside, gulls cried along the cliffs. The wind had begun to pick up again. Then footsteps. 2 sets. approaching quickly. Inspector Darnley entered first, breath misting in the cold air. Behind him came Sylvette, her face pale, but calm. "Monsieur Poirot," Darnley said, voice sharp. "We found Gabriel's coat in the woods. Torn. There was blood on the cuff. He's missing." Poirot frowned. "Missing." He left through the servants' path. A fisherman down the coast saw him heading toward the quarry cliffs, alone. Sylvette stepped forward. "He won't jump," she said flatly. "Gabriel doesn't believe in tragedy, only in legacy." Poirot looked to Mornay, then to Sylvette. "Then we must go to him. Now. Before legacy drives him to bury the truth one final time." They arrived at the cliffs just as twilight began to smother the sky. The sea was loud here, slamming itself against the rocks, as though protesting every footstep. The path to the quarry chapel was narrow, winding between jagged boulders and tufts of rust-colored heather. At the base of the slope, within the moss-laced mouth of the old chapel ruins, they saw him. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall stood before the old altar, the same from a photograph, gazing down at something wrapped in oilcloth. The statue. He must have retrieved it, dragged it back. Gabriel turned slowly at the sound of their approach. "Don't come any closer," he said. "You have what you want. The carving. The truth. Let that be enough." Poirot raised a hand. "And what do you intend to do, monsieur? Smash it? Hide it again?" "It is too late." Gabriel's face twisted. "My father died a hero. That's how people remember him. You would undo that, for what? An old stone? A man who changed his name and lied for decades." Mornay stepped forward now, quietly. "I lied to survive," he said. "I didn't betray the passage. Your father did. But I never wanted revenge, Gabriel. Only peace. Druitt tried to give us that. And you killed him for it." The words landed like blows. Gabriel's shoulders slumped. "I didn't mean to," he said. He drank the tea. "I only meant to frighten him. I thought he'd stop the sculpture. But when he died, when the marble disappeared, I thought the secret had died with him." Poirot stepped forward. "It never does. Truth is patient, monsieur. It waits in stone, in silence, in memory." Gabriel looked down at the covered sculpture. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. "I won't run," he said. "But I won't speak at the trial." Poirot nodded solemnly. "Then you will have already said more than most." The wind howled once more, sharp and unforgiving. But the truth, at last, had found its breath. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The quarry chapel stood in solemn ruin, cloaked in sea mist and crowned with ivy. Even now, with the truth laid bare and the sculpted monument exposed once more, the atmosphere carried the strange stillness of a graveyard, not of bones, but of secrets buried in stone. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall sat slumped on a fallen slab of granite, wrists draped over his knees, his eyes no longer sharp with defiance, but clouded with something worse, resignation. Hercule Poirot stood nearby, hat tucked beneath his arm, coat buttoned against the cold, his silhouette steady against the rising wind. Inspector Darnley had sent for a constable to escort Gabriel back to the village. But Poirot waited. There was still something yet unsaid, something not quite resolved. Sylvette stepped into the chapel ruins quietly, her gaze drifting over the cracked altar, and then to the oilcloth-covered sculpture. The wind caught a corner of the cloth and lifted it ever so slightly, revealing the base of the statue's foot, roughly hewn, still marked with the chisel's last hesitation. She turned to Gabriel. "You looked at it, didn't you?" she asked. He didn't answer. "You saw the face, the expression, and still, you thought it would destroy you." Gabriel's head rose slowly. "I saw my father, and the shame I spent a lifetime trying to rewrite." "You saw yourself," Sylvette said evenly. "You saw what silence makes a people." Poirot watched this exchange with quiet intensity. Gabriel's voice was hoarse. "Do you know what it is to build a name from rubble? To watch the house your father built stand on foundations you know are cracked? I couldn't let Druitt drag it all down." "You let him die," she said, her tone sharp now. "You let him carry that weight to the very end. And for what? A plaque in the guild? A family crest on a letterhead?" He looked away. Sylvette turned to Poirot. What happens now? Poirot stepped forward, his voice low but unwavering. What happens now, mademoiselle, is that justice must have its turn. He turned to Gabriel. You may not have planned to kill Drouet, but the intent was to manipulate, to frighten. You laced his drink with something you barely understood, thinking it would shake him. Instead, it stopped his heart. Gabriel spoke without lifting his eyes. He was going to tell everyone about the statue, about what my father did, about the betrayal. I thought if he fell ill, I could convince him to stop. And when you saw the statue had vanished, Gabriel gave a sad smile. I thought fate had intervened on my behalf. Poirot shook his head. Fate is not so merciful, monsieur. Only delayed. From outside the chapel came the sound of footsteps, boots crunching over gravel. A constable appeared, nodding once to Darnley before placing a gentle but firm hand on Gabriel's shoulder. The man rose without resistance. I'll speak to no reporters, he said. No interviews. No one will ask, Darnley replied. Not for me. Gabriel looked once more at the sculpture before being led away. As his figure disappeared into the mist, a silence fell again, one tinged not with suspense, but with sorrow. Poirot stepped to the sculpture, and with slow ceremony, peeled back the oilcloth fully. There it stood in full, taller than life, carved with agonizing precision. The kneeling figure of Bertrand Mornay, arms outstretched not in guilt, but in grief. Around him, other forms loomed, abstracted shapes of memory, judgment, and war. The face was not one of betrayal. It was a burden. Sylvette drew in a slow breath. It's not an accusation. It's a lament. Poirot nodded. Your father did not carve vengeance into this stone. He carved his remorse, his uncertainty, and his hope. He gestured to the statue's base, where a small inscription had been revealed in the light. Memory is not justice, but it is a beginning. Sylvette's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of release. Poirot turned to Mornay, Kent, who stood near the chapel's entrance, shoulders rigid, face unreadable. You have lived in silence a long time, monsieur, Poirot said gently. It is not too late to speak. Mornay looked toward the sculpture, then back to Poirot. I will, he said quietly, when the time is right. Poirot nodded once. Then let us return. The stone has spoken. And now, it is the living who must decide what to do with his words. As they turned to leave the chapel, the mist began to lift at last. Not fully, but enough to see the path ahead, and enough to know that whatever remained of the past, its weight, its wounds, had finally been shared. The truth was no longer hidden. It stood in marble, waiting. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Night fell with an unsettling haste. Mornmere Hall stood silhouetted against a deepening sky, its windows glowing faintly like weary eyes refusing sleep. Inside, the house was unusually still. The storm had passed, but an unease lingered, like smoke after a fire. Poirot returned from the chapel to find Inspector Darnley stationed in the library, arms folded across his chest, brow furrowed. A constable had escorted Sir Gabriel to the village for processing, and Darnley had wasted no time ensuring the rest of the estate was secured. But even as the pieces of the crime seemed to settle into place, Poirot's instincts whispered something unfinished. He stood near the hearth, warming his hands. There is one matter that still troubles me, he murmured. Darnley looked up. You think we've missed something? Perhaps not missed, Poirot said, but overlooked. He turned and walked to the window. The grounds were dark, save for the soft pool of lamplight near the gatehouse. Where is Monsieur Kent, Mornay, now? Resting, Darnley said. He's been placed under observation in the east wing. I posted a man at the hall entrance to make sure he doesn't leave before we've taken his statement in full. Poirot nodded absently, but he was already uneasy. There was a rhythm to guilt, a pattern to concealment. And the truly desperate never stopped at one lie. They layered falsehood upon falsehood, until it became a cage of their own making. Bertrand Mornay had emerged from hiding. He had confessed in part. But had he told all? Poirot moved to the sideboard, where the documents from the chapel archive still rested. Among the folded letters and aged records, something caught his eye. The corner of an envelope, tucked beneath the base of the wooden box. Not labeled. Lightly dusted, as though untouched for years. Poirot extracted it gently. Inside was a letter, written in the same handwriting as the one addressed to Drouet. If you are reading this, it means I have failed to stop the carving. I told you what I saw, what I knew. But you chose to believe the others. You carved the face anyway. I cannot allow it to be unveiled. Not if I am to survive this. Forgive me. I did not wish to kill. But I must disappear again. There was no signature. But Poirot no longer needed one. He turned sharply to Darnley. Quickly. To the east wing. Now. They arrived just in time to find the constable unconscious. Slumped in a chair, a thin trickle of blood at his temple. A fireplace poker discarded on the floor beside him. Poirot rushed to the window. Open, curtain swaying. Outside, the night air was sharp with chill and the scent of the sea. The garden wall beyond the terrace showed faint scuff marks. Fresh. Saker. Poirot hissed. He has fled. Darnley swore under his breath. We'll search the grounds. I'll alert the station. He can't have gotten far. No, Poirot said sharply. You'll waste time in the hedges. Head for the cliffs. The cliffs? Darnley asked. Poirot turned, eyes burning with intensity. Where else would a man return but the sight of his shame? He ran once before. Now he tries again. The path to the quarry chapel had grown more treacherous by nightfall. The wind whipped violently across the stone ridges. Lanterns flickered as they descended. Poirot's coat flapped like a pennant, his steps quick and determined despite the uneven ground. And there, at the foot of the altar, stood Bertrand Mornay, wild-eyed, lantern in one hand, something long and heavy in the other, a crowbar. He turned at the sound of their approach. Don't come any closer, he shouted. I have to do this. It has to end. Behind him, the sculpture loomed, still intact, still watching. You lied, Poirot said calmly. You claimed the statue was your fear, but it was always your fault. I didn't mean to kill him, Mornay snapped. I only wanted to stop him, to stop what he was about to show. You poisoned Drouet, not Sir Gabriel. Mornay's face contorted. He wouldn't let it go. That face, that altar, it was my past written in stone. Poirot took a slow step forward, but he gave you a chance to speak. I told him to delay the exhibition. I begged. He refused. And so you acted. Mornay dropped the lantern to the ground. Its light cast distorted shadows up the statue's face. I laced his tea with the aconite, he confessed. I knew how much. Just enough. He'd be weak, forgetful. I thought I could control him. But he died, Poirot said softly. And then you panicked. Moved the statue. Blame Gabriel. Mornay's hand tightened on the crowbar. He believed I was dead once. I should have stayed that way. Non, Poirot said, stepping closer. You carved a new life, yes. But it was built on evasion, not redemption. Darnley raised his hand slightly, signaling his constables in the distance. Mornay took a final breath, looked to the sculpture, and dropped the crowbar. I couldn't destroy it, he said. Not really. It was the only honest thing either of us ever made. Poirot moved beside him, his voice like a final whisper of judgment. Confession is not weakness, monsieur. But murder, however veiled, is cowardice. Mornay sank to his knees as the constables moved in. And, at last, the quarry chapel was silent again. The statue, unmarred, stood above them, judging no one, but remembering everything. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The events of the past 48 hours had unfolded like a slow-moving storm, quiet, relentless, and impossible to ignore. And now, in the wake of Bertrand Mornay's attempted flight and emotional confession, the final contours of the mystery at Mornmere Hall had begun to settle. The lies had been told, the secrets unearthed, and the ghosts of the past summoned into the light. But Poirot, ever meticulous, knew that closure demanded more than confession. It demanded clarity. Morning arrived draped in pale mist, and yet a strange sense of calm had returned to the estate. The police had taken Mornay into custody. This time not as a quiet assistant named Kent, but as the man long believed dead, Bertrand Mornay, former soldier, accused betrayer, and now revealed murderer. Yet Poirot did not celebrate. He sat alone in the study, the cracked photograph of the resistance, men spread before him once more. He studied each face again, the eyes, the posture, the unguarded moment caught in black and white. And something, at last, slid into place in his mind with a gentle, decisive click. C'est ça, et murmure. He reached for the archive papers and opened the final envelope, the one Sylvette had handed him the morning before. A draft of a letter never sent. Drouet's handwriting, jagged and dense. If I am gone, Sylvette must decide. She will know what to do with the statue. Not to destroy it, but to protect it. Not from scandal, but from misinterpretation. Poirot tapped the page thoughtfully. He then rose, took his cane, and went to find Sylvette. He found her in the sculpture room, once her father's sanctuary, now a mausoleum of unspoken memories. She was standing in the light from the tall windows, dust dancing around her as she examined her own sketch, still tacked to the wall, beside the bench. She didn't turn when she heard him. You knew, didn't you, she said quietly, that he meant it to be seen? Poirot nodded. Oui. He trusted you. Despite everything, he saw your hand in the marble, the gentleness in the face, the grief. It was not solely his creation. Sylvette turned, her eyes damp. I didn't realize until it was too late. He made me believe he didn't care about legacy. But he did. Just not in the way the others thought. He didn't want to be remembered. He wanted the truth remembered. Poirot stepped toward the statue, now returned to the hall and placed, at her insistence, in a modest gallery room that would open to the guild by season's end. He carved it not to accuse, Poirot said, but to relieve himself of the burden of silence. And he knew only you would understand that distinction. She walked to the bench and picked up the old chisel, her father's favorite. It still bore the worn marks of his hand, the faint impression of decades' use. I hated him sometimes, she whispered, for his distance, for the things he wouldn't share. But I never stopped admiring him. Poirot studied her gently. And what of Mornay? He asked. Will you visit him? I don't know, she said. I haven't decided if I want forgiveness or understanding, or whether I owe either. Poirot said nothing. Some decisions were not for him. He stepped back, letting her be alone with the tools, the marble dust, and her grief. In the drawing room, Poirot reconvened with Inspector Darnley, who stood reviewing a final report. Signed confession for Mornay, Darnley said. He's admitted to poisoning Drouet and staging the studio to hide it. Says he panicked. Couldn't bear to let the statue go public. And Sir Gabriel? Poirot asked. Will face charges for obstruction and attempted poisoning of the housekeeper. The court will decide his intent. But he's cooperating now. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. And Mrs. Fallow? She's recovering, Darnley said. Apparently had suspected something for days, but was too afraid to speak. She'll be all right. Poirot allowed himself a sigh, a brief moment of release. I am glad. Darnley arched an eyebrow. And you? Satisfied. Poirot gave a small smile. Satisfaction is not always the reward of truth, he said. But clarity, that is always its own reward. Darnley shook his head, amused. I'll leave the philosophy to you, Monsieur Poirot. But it's been a hell of a case. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Indeed. Layers upon layers, like stone worked over and over until the original surface is no longer visible. But in the end, even marble must reveal what it has hidden. That evening, as the sun set behind the craggy cliffs and the sea glistened gold in its final hour, Poirot stood once more before the sculpture. He touched its base gently, as one might place a hand on a grave. Then he whispered, Your masterpiece lives. And so, monsieur, shall the truth. And with that he turned from the marble, no longer a mystery, but a message, and made his way slowly through the darkened corridor, leaving silence, not secrets, in his wake. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The invitation was not a formal one. No summons, no grand announcement. Just a quiet word passed down from Hercule Poirot to Inspector Darnley, and then discreetly to each guest of Mornmere Hall. After dinner, in the long, firelit drawing room, everyone was to gather, one last time. They came, as if drawn by gravity. Sylvette arrived first, dressed simply in dark blue, her expression composed but unreadable. Lucian Broom followed shortly after, having made a rare appearance, without his habitual drink in hand. Lavinia Whitelake entered alone, and sat near the far window, notebook tucked under her arm like a shield. Even Mrs. Fallow, pale but recovering, joined the gathering, supported by a maid, and settled into a cushioned chair near the fire. Poirot entered last. He wore his most tailored evening coat, his mustaches impeccable, his eyes as sharp as ever. In his hand he held a folded sheet of paper, and beside him stood Inspector Darnley, silent, watchful. "Miss Amos," Poirot began, "thank you for coming. I will not detain you long, but there is one final duty owed to the truth." No one spoke. Poirot stepped closer to the firelight. "You have all been part of a story that began decades ago in war-torn France, when 5 men gathered around a stone altar, each carrying with him secrets, loyalties, and fears. One of those men, Bertrand Mornay, was believed to have betrayed the others. Another, Ignatius Drouet, believed himself the keeper of justice. And a third, Gabriel Rivenhall, believed silence would preserve legacy. He glanced at Sylvette. A fourth, though not present then, was bound by blood and art to them all. Sylvette's face remained still, though her hands tightened slightly around her skirt. Poirot continued. Ignatius Drouet spent his life in sculpture, shaping the past into forms he could live with. But his final masterpiece was not for beauty. It was a confession. He turned to the others. It was not the guild he meant to impress, nor the critics. He carved that statue to speak, to tell a truth that words had failed to carry. He held up the folded paper in his hand. This, he said, was his final note, found in the same false compartment as the photograph and the hidden letters. A message written for his daughter, but kept back at the last moment. He read aloud, "My hands have shaped saints and sinners alike. But I am no judge, only a witness. If I cannot speak aloud what haunts me, then let the marble do so. Let those who see it decide what was justice and what was simply war." A long silence followed. Poirot folded the note and placed it on the mantel. "It is not only a message," he said, "but a torch. Passed to all of you." He looked at Lavinia. "You, Madame Whitelake, must decide how you tell this story. As a historian, you hold power over the past. Be careful how you wield it." Lavinia's mouth twitched, but she said nothing. Her pen remained capped. Poirot turned to Lucian Broom next. "You will no doubt find some way to insert this tale into the guild's proud annals. But I advise restraint. This is not a victory for reputation. It is a reckoning." Broom gave a small nod, more humbled than usual. Poirot stepped toward Sylvette now. "And you, mademoiselle, must choose what your father's legacy will be. The sculpture is yours, by right and by love. But so is the truth." Sylvette stood. "I will exhibit it," she said softly, "as he intended, without plaque or interpretation. Let those who see it decide what it means." Poirot smiled faintly, spoken like an artist. He moved back toward the fire, eyes reflecting the glow. "And now," he said, "the one question that must be asked." He turned to the room at large. Was justice served? The question hovered in the air, unanswered. Poirot did not expect a reply. He gave them a moment to reflect, then continued with quiet dignity. "Justice is not always a trial, nor is guilt always punished in court. In this case, a killer was unmasked. A legacy was corrected, and the marble, the marble, remains untouched." He stepped aside, allowing the firelight to resume center stage. "I thank you all for your cooperation, your patience, and your courage. I shall take my leave in the morning." He bowed once, then turned to leave. But just before he reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "One last word," he said. "When you next see the statue, do not look at the face alone. Look at the hands. They hold no weapon, no judgment, only sorrow." And with that he departed. The fire crackled softly. The guests remained seated for a while, each lost in their own thoughts, as if trying to read meaning in the embers. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the windows like fingertips across glass. Inside, the silence was no longer burdened with secrets. Only the truth. And stone. Chapter 16, The Reveal. The morning that followed was clear and crisp, as if the sea itself had finally exhaled. Mornmere Hall, for all its heavy walls and haunted galleries, looked softened in the light, less like a bastion of secrets, and more like a place that had simply endured them. Hercule Poirot stood alone in the sculpture room. The statue, Drouet's final masterpiece, had been repositioned with care. It now stood in a place of honor, bathed in natural light that poured through the tall, arched windows. The veined marble gleamed, no longer hidden in caves or veiled beneath oilcloth. For the first time, the figure at its heart, kneeling, arms extended not in surrender, but in supplication, was visible as the artist had intended. Poirot studied the work not as a detective, but as a man who understood grief. The details were more than artistic, they were emotional. The subtle downward tilt of the head, the lines that were carved into the face, the way the fingers curled inward slightly, as if cradling not a burden, but an apology. "Beautiful," came a voice behind him. Sylvette entered quietly, dressed in a simple gray coat, her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She approached the statue and looked at it not with wonder, but with acceptance. "He never told me what it meant," she said, "but I think I know now. It was never about judgment. It was about forgiveness and failure." Poirot nodded. "He gave the figure to your hands." She blinked. "What?" He gestured to the sculpture's wrists carved with gentle fullness, and a slight indentation along the base of the thumb, exactly as Sylvette's sketch had depicted months earlier in one of her early drafts. "He could not give you credit openly, but he gave you presence," Poirot said. "You were not only the future of his art. You were the one he hoped would carry the meaning." Sylvette's expression wavered. "I almost destroyed it," she whispered, "when I learned what it represented, who it showed. I thought it was betrayal." But instead, Poirot said softly, "It was remembrance." She nodded once, lips pressed tightly, and stepped back. The door opened again. This time, Lavinia Whitelake entered with Lucian Broom trailing behind her. They both stopped when they saw the statue, as if encountering it for the first time, though they had glimpsed it before. "It's more human than I expected," Lavinia said, carefully adjusting her spectacles. "There's pain in it, yes, but no violence." Broom spoke from the back. "The guild will want to showcase it. Of course, it's yours to decide, Sylvette." "I'll allow it," Sylvette said, "but not with their plaque. It must be shown without commentary, without names. Let the viewers see what they wish to see." Poirot gave an approving nod. "Très bien. That is the artist's truest voice." Darnley arrived shortly after, a folded document in hand. "It's official," he said. "Bertrand Mornay has been charged. The trial will follow. Sir Gabriel will testify, reluctantly. But it seems the court will view his role as secondary." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And the motive?" Darnley sighed. "Mornay's confession holds. He claimed he feared exposure, not out of guilt for war crimes, but because he believed no one would ever believe he wasn't a traitor." Poirot murmured, "The weight of guilt, deserved or not, can drive a man to tragic extremes." Lavinia shifted uncomfortably. "Do you think he's lying even now?" Poirot considered it. "No. I believe Bertrand Mornay was many things, a coward perhaps, a man broken by memory, but not a liar in the end. When he saw the statue, he saw himself through Drouet's eyes, and it frightened him." He looked at Sylvette once more. "Your father carved the truth, and that, mademoiselle, is what saved us all." She said nothing, but her expression softened. Poirot took one final turn around the statue, stepping back with the measured steps of a curator, not an inspector. Then he turned to Darnley. "I will take the noon train." Darnley nodded. "You've earned your rest." Poirot gave a small smile. "Rest, perhaps. But in my experience, the train brings only new mysteries at the next stop." As the others drifted away, Sylvette remained. She stood before the statue, her arms crossed, not protectively, but thoughtfully. The morning light gleamed on the marble surface like a second skin. Then she reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a chisel, her father's. She held it for a long moment, then walked slowly to the base of the sculpture. With quiet reverence, she placed the chisel at its feet, not as a tool, as an offering. And with that, the room grew still again. Outside, gulls wheeled over the cliffs. The tide rolled in, and in the heart of Mornmere Hall, carved in silence, the truth remained untouched, unjudged, and unforgotten. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The court proceedings, when they came, were quiet affairs, lacking the theatricality often associated with high-profile trials. There were no flashing cameras, no eager reporters crowding the steps. Just a solemn hall, a few hardened spectators, and a marble truth that had spoken louder than any witness ever could. Bertrand Mornay sat stiff-backed during the hearings, now fully unmasked to the world as the man thought lost during the war. His confession had been clear and full. He did not deny poisoning Ignatius Drouet. He did not ask for leniency. What he offered instead was an admission that came not from self-pity, but from resignation. He was trying to make peace, he said during the final session. And I mistook that for exposure. His words were repeated in print, but never broadcast widely. The scandal was too quiet, too tragic, too layered in grief for sensational headlines. The court sentenced him to 15 years, a balance between the weight of the crime and the strange empathy it evoked in the public. Sir Gabriel Rivenhall, despite his role in the second attempted poisoning, was charged with obstruction and reckless endangerment. His cooperation with the investigation and the testimony of others lessened his sentence. He was given 3 years, suspended, with the condition he resign from all guild positions and retreat from public life. The guild issued no formal apology, but in the autumn newsletter, buried between notices of exhibitions and restorations, a single sentence stood out. The final work of Ignatius Drouet will be displayed without attribution, as per his daughter's request, as a memorial to the burden of memory and the complexity of truth. For those who knew it was enough, Poirot, by then, had returned to London. His apartment on Whitehaven Mansions was, as he had left it, immaculate. The scent of fresh lilies in the vase near the window, the ticking of the mantel clock, the perfectly aligned set of slippers near the hearth. Hastings, visiting for tea, read the newspaper aloud from his armchair. Well, old boy, you've done it again. No fanfare, no medals, just a small blurb in the paper and a statue on a plinth. Poirot sipped his hot chocolate. Ah, mon ami, do you not see? That is the very essence of justice. Quiet, unassuming, and often left uncelebrated. Hastings chuckled. Still, I dare say it was one of your more unusual cases. A murderer who was also a victim. A statue as a confession. Not your typical business. No, Poirot agreed. But it was not typical guilt either. He set down his cup. What do we remember of people, Hastings? Their crimes? Their triumphs? Or their silences? Hastings frowned. Their silences? Poirot nodded. Yes. The things they never say. The apologies never spoken. The grief was never voiced. That statue, that was a man's silence given form. It condemned no one. It simply asked to be understood. Hastings looked thoughtful for a moment. It seems a heavy thing to carry. Poirot smiled, faintly wistful. All truth is. Far away, in a gallery newly renovated on the Cornish coast, visitors stepped softly through the exhibit. Some paused before the marble statue, its placard reading only, Untitled, 1954. Artist unknown. Some stared at the kneeling figure and saw sorrow. Others saw humility. A few saw only stone, but none left unmoved. And in the quiet that lingered after each footstep faded, the air held something far more lasting than scandal or revenge. It held understanding. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. It was a clear, golden afternoon when Hercule Poirot returned once more to Mornmere Hall. Months had passed since the trial. The estate, though quieter, felt less burdened by its ghosts. A new caretaker had taken over the grounds, and the ivy had been trimmed back from the stone arches. The sea, visible from the garden, shimmered peacefully. Poirot had not come on business. He had come, as he said to Inspector Darnley in his last letter, to bid farewell not to a case, but to a memory. Sylvette Drouet met him at the threshold of the now converted East Gallery. It had taken her weeks to prepare, but at last the sculpture stood in its permanent place, centered beneath a high window where natural light poured down each morning in dusk, casting its shadow long across the polished floor. "You returned," she said with a soft smile. "I wasn't sure you would." Poirot inclined his head. When one has followed a path through fog and darkness, one must always return in the light. N'est-ce pas? She guided him in. The room was spare but reverent. The walls bore no interpretive plaques, no timelines, no curatorial commentary. Just space and silence. And the sculpture, Drouet's final work. Poirot stood before it once more, hands clasped behind his back, eyes traveling over every plane and curve. Time had not dulled its power. If anything, it had sharpened it. He spoke softly, more to himself than to Sylvette. "It is strange. A man spent his life shaping stone, and in the end it was the stone that shaped him." Sylvette stepped beside him. "He wasn't perfect. I know that now. But he didn't want to be. He just wanted to be understood." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you have given him that. A daughter's forgiveness is the rarest of all gifts." She looked at him carefully. "And what of you, Monsieur Poirot? Do you believe justice was done?" Poirot did not answer at once. Instead, he stepped closer to the statue. At its base, where once the chisel had rested, there now lay a single inscription, carved not by Ignatius Drouet, but by Sylvette herself. Small, subtle, barely noticeable until one stood near. What is carved in stone may still be forgiven. Poirot read it, then smiled faintly. "I believe," he said at last, "that justice is not always the hammer that strikes. Sometimes it is the hand that chooses not to." He turned, adjusting his coat. "The world will forget the trial. It will forget the scandal. But this," he gestured toward the marble, "this will remain. And in remaining it will speak, without judgment, without defense. Only truth." Sylvette's eyes shimmered. "I never thanked you properly," she said, "for what you uncovered, for what you left untouched." Poirot waved a hand gently. "Mademoiselle, I merely listened. It was your father who spoke, and you who heard." He made his way toward the door, where the sea breeze met the scent of fresh-cut grass. As he stepped into the light, he paused, his voice carrying back one final time. "Ah, but there is one last mystery." Sylvette looked up, curious. Poirot turned, his eyes twinkling. "Tell me, mademoiselle, do you believe the statue was truly his final masterpiece?" Sylvette smiled. "Perhaps not. But it was the only one that told his story." Poirot nodded, satisfied. "Then we may leave the past in peace." And with that, Hercule Poirot, detective, observer, guardian of quiet truths, walked down the long gravel path of Mornmere Hall, his silhouette growing small against the sea-drenched horizon. No applause, no final curtain, just the soft echo of footsteps. And behind him, a figure of marble, kneeling, enduring, at peace.